Hi there and welcome to the History Teacher. This revision video covers Early Elizabethan England 1558 to 1588 from the GCSE Edexcel 9-1 course. Hopefully you'll also find it useful if you are studying any of the other exam boards or if, just like me, you love history. Hi there guys, today we're going to be looking at the attitudes of the Elizabethans to poverty and how it changed during Elizabeth's reign. Firstly, we need to understand what the definition of poverty in the Elizabethan age was. This is always important when looking at poverty, no matter what period of history you're looking at, because what is poor to one person might not be poor to another. For example, one person might say that not being able to afford the latest iPhone means you're poor, while another might say that not being able to afford any phone means you are poor. We have to have clear definitions. The main definition in Elizabeth's time was that if 80% or more of your income was spent on bread, you were poor. Also included was the need to claim poor relief, being unable to afford the rising costs of food, and being unemployed or unable to work. We'll come to some of the reasons for these circumstances in a minute. There were groups in society that were particularly likely to be in poverty. For example, children under 16 made up over 40% of those claiming poor relief. Many of these children were orphans. Another group particularly hard hit was widows. When their husbands died, they were unable to work and earn enough money to support themselves and their children because of the inequality in work for men and women. The sick and the elderly were unable to work and therefore could not earn any money, and those who became unemployed for whatever reason found themselves claiming poor relief. Some of the poor became vagrants or vagabonds due to not being able to afford their rents, and they were dealt with harshly under the law. So what were vagrants and vagabonds? A vagrant is a term simply referring to a person who does not have a settled home or employment and who wanders from place to place and lives by begging. A vagabond is a vagrant who has turned to crime. They were seen as a serious threat to social order. During the entire 16th century, there was a huge increase in poverty, those seeking poor relief, and vagrancy for a number of reasons. It's important that you understand these reasons and can link them together. The population boomed in the later half of the 16th century. Between 1550 and 1601, the population increased by nearly 50%, from 3 million to 4.2 million. The increase in those looking for work meant that wages decreased. This is because when there are huge numbers of people applying for the same job, the employer can offer a lower wage and still employ someone. The increase in population also led to an increase in demand for food, pushing the price up, and an increase in rents. The increase in rent was particularly hard because there were so many tenants vying for the few properties. Owners could charge an entry fee which had to be paid at the beginning of the tenancy, which meant that many poor people could not even afford to begin renting a property. This demand on food and land was particularly felt in the towns and cities, where huge numbers of the poor would travel looking for work. The towns could not import enough food, which drove the cost up. Added to the general demands created by an increase in the population, there were another couple of factors that made things worse. Throughout Elizabeth's reign, there were a series of bad harvests which led to a shortage of food. With more people and less food, the price of food increased rapidly. There was also economic problems which led to a series of recessions, where people were not buying as much due to trade disputes with Spain and the Netherlands. These led to merchants and traders not having as much money and therefore having to sack employees, leading to an increase in the number of unemployed. During Elizabeth's reign, many farmers were turning to wool as their main income rather than crops. This in turn led to less farming of crops and therefore less food. Additionally, sheep farming is less labour intensive than crop farming, and so less employees were needed on the farms, so even more people lost their jobs. The increase in sheep farming also led to an increase in the enclosure of land. Quite simply, less land became common, which was available to all, and more was fenced off for private land. Many of the poor who had relied on the common land to grow their own food and graze their own animals found themselves unable to sustain their way of life and found themselves driven towards the towns to find employment. This huge increase in the number of unemployed and food poverty was made worse by the closure of the monasteries under Henry VIII. Traditionally, these monasteries would have provided charity and support for the poor, but with them gone, poor had nowhere to turn. The increase in the number of poor also saw an increase in the fear of crime. Many wealthy Elizabethans were afraid that poverty was driving a crime wave. The sheer numbers of the poor had also led to them becoming more visible, and this made the rich feel threatened. The cost of the poor rates was also increasing, and some members of Parliament and justices of the peace began to re-evaluate how the poor were being helped. Some were aware that the poor were not all responsible for the situation they found themselves in and pointed out the economic causes. The Elizabethans had very clear ideas about poverty and who deserved help and who did not. The poor were categorised into two distinct groups. The deserving poor, known as the impotent poor, were those who were incapable of work, so orphans, widows and the sick who were supported by poor relief either through money or providing raw materials to allow them to produce objects for sale. The undeserving poor, or idle poor, were the able-bodied unemployed. These people were treated badly and often found it difficult to claim poor relief, forcing them into begging or crime. The Elizabethans believed that the poor should be given every opportunity to improve themselves, and failure or refusal to do so would be punished. Vagabonds were treated especially harshly, with severe punishments for begging and petty crime. So there are two main themes that the examiners might ask you about. The first is the causes of poverty, which we've just discussed, and the second is how and how much the way the poor were treated during Elizabeth's reign changed. So, to understand that, we need to know what the situation was when Elizabeth became queen. I've already mentioned poor relief a number of times, and this was a payment given to the poor. The money was raised by a poor rate, a tax on wealthy people, which they had to pay and was collected by the Justice of the Peace. However, lots of people just avoided the tax, and in some cases, the local Justice of the Peace made no effort to collect the tax. So some areas had no poor relief at all. Charity was another key way of supporting the poor. Many wealthy people donated to charities, which normally focused on specific groups and locations, for example, orphans or widows. These were not consistent, so again, some areas or groups were left without any support whatsoever. However, in 1563, Elizabeth began to formalise poor relief. The 1563 Statute of Artificers punished those refusing to pay poor rates, with a maximum penalty of jail time. It also fined officials who did not organise a poor tax with a fine of £20. Then, in 1576, the Poor Relief Act now required the Justice of the Peace to provide the poor with materials such as wool or leather with which they could make things to sell and therefore support themselves. However, anybody refusing to make things was sent to a house of correction, which was a special prison where the inmates did hard labour in an effort to correct their behaviour. Both of these laws were progressive. They were responsive to a fall in the wool trade and did aim to provide the poor with a means of making an income. In 1572, a Vagabonds Act imposed 3 levels of punishment for acts of vagrancy, begging or petty theft. On the first offence, the person would be publicly whipped and have a hole drilled into both ears to act as a warning to others. The second offence would lead them to being imprisoned, and those caught in a third offence were executed. The law also set a national poor rate, which provided money and work for the impotent poor, and the Justice of the Peace had to keep a register of those claiming poor relief. The law also said that JPs and other authorities had to find work for the able poor. This law was partly progressive in that it centralised the system and focused on providing support for the impotent poor and work for the able, but was regressive in that it was a reaction to fears about crime caused by vagrants and focused on punishing them. Okay, that is everything for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment. I always reply as quickly as I can. Don't forget, if you like my content, I'd really appreciate it if you buy me a coffee to keep me going. The link is in the description. That's everything for today, and I will see you next time.